Our next guest does not really need an introduction. He's a great in my mind. He wrote the very famous book, taught my mom all about politics, actually, when he wrote What's the Matter with Kansas? And I think the generation of 2016 learned everything about the Democratic Party from his book, Listen Liberal. And he has a recent book out called Rendezvous with Oblivion. It's a series of essays. Of course, I'm talking about the one, the only Thomas Frank. Thank you so much for joining the Nomiki Show.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
So last time I talked to you on a set, interviewed you, we were, I think it was the year after, 2017, in Washington. Yeah. And at that point, Listen Liberal had recently come out, and we'd had this horrific election in 2016 in which the Democrats should have learned all of their lessons. If they didn't from the experience, they should have read your book and learned from your documentation of what went wrong and how to fix it. But here we are in 2020, moving into the Iowa caucuses, and it seems like the establishment is playing the same tricks. What's your take?
Well, it's the same two wings of the party going at it again. It's not quite as ferocious as 2016. There was this real sense in 2016 that challenging the sort of leadership faction of the party, the centrist faction of the party, that challenging them was an illegitimate thing to do. That was in some way not acceptable, or not playing by the rules or something like that. Which honestly, I get it culturally. I get that that's what they thought, but it's kind of a silly thing. The whole idea of democracy is there's more than one candidate, and Hillary Clinton was not the incumbent, et cetera. And so it was an open primary. And this time it's even more wide open. How many candidates were there in the beginning? But it is boiling down to the centrist faction against the liberal faction, and we're going to see what happens. And you're seeing a lot of the same rhetoric get wheeled out. I think, obviously the biggest difference is it looks like Bernie Sanders has a real chance to win this time, which is really remarkable.
As of today, he is leading in the polls. He has the widest margin.
Exactly. I couldn't believe it when I saw that last night. It's really remarkable.
It's incredible. And in terms of head to head with Trump, he has the widest margin in defeating Trump, which,
Right. But that's something that's very difficult for people to understand. There, especially people here in Washington, D.C., there is this way in which we've internalized this kind of geometry of politics, where people think that the closer you are to the center, understood in a kind of geometric sense, like here's the left, here's the right, there's the center, it's in between them both. Therefore, the person in the center is, automatically going to be the most effective challenger. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there's a political science name for it. Oh, now I had it on the tip of my tongue a second ago, and now I've forgotten.
Quick, Google it.
what this theory is called. But it's it doesn't even really need to have a name. It's something that everyone in Washington knows is true. You don't even need to think about it. It's just obvious to them. And so it's a complete surprise. It's counterintuitive. It's not really thinkable when you say that someone like Bernie, who is obviously off to the left of the party, that someone like Bernie actually has is a stronger candidate against Trump than someone in the center like Buttigieg or even Joe Biden. But nevertheless, that is the case.
You've documented this quite a bit, but does that have much to do with the institutions that are supporting the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party itself, and the people who make up the ecosystem of Beltway politics being supported by, essentially big business?
Yes. No, I wouldn't say big business. Oh, by the way, I thought of it's called the median voter theory. And the median voter theory, the idea is that the voter in the middle is the one who gets what they want. So you have to move to the middle, and that's the only way that you win an election. And that has been sort of refuted and countered in all sorts of different ways. But it's, like I say, it's common sense here in Washington, D.C. Now, the thing about it is that the people who call themselves centrists, who say that they're in the middle of the spectrum, really aren't. Right. I don't know if you're aware. If you're aware of this. Well, a perfect example that we're talking about right now, Joe Biden's his openness to cuts to Social Security over the decades, right. And this is extremely well documented. He's part of that faction. This is in Listen Liberal, which I wrote 5 years ago now, not. As it pertains to Biden, but as it pertains to Bill Clinton and the Clinton administration. And they came up with all sorts of plans for privatizing Social Security. And they probably would have got it done had it not been for for Bill Clinton's impeachment. Well, here's the thing that's going to blow your mind, Nomi. That may be the position of the faction in the party that calls itself centrist, but that is not like in the center of American opinion at all. That is the sort of a consensus opinion of a certain kind of American, a certain very well-to-do white collar, an American that's had some exposure to academic economics, that sort of thing. And they tend to believe that. They also tend to believe very predictable things about, say, trade issues. There's a whole series of questions where they believe very strongly things that the American public does not believe, that are not even close to the center. But we call them the centrist faction because they're in.
The Republicans are so far right. I don't know.
Yes, and they're in the center of politics as it's played in Washington, D.C.
So it's interesting.
By the kind of ecosystem of this city, the sort of, the cultural ecosystem of this city, they're kind of in the middle.
It's interesting because when Donald Trump ran, obviously he was a threat to the Republican establishment, and they did some sort of quasi deal to get the tax breaks for the Republican Party and their supporters, and of course now they're locked up for the reelection. But with that being said, I think he confused the Democratic Party as well. I mean, they're investing in Joe Biden and thinking that Joe Biden acting like he supports the working class versus having the values, the anti-establishment values, and also the values that represent working people. I mean, to me, it just seems like such an obvious misstep that will lead us into 2016. But with that being said, you bring up a really interesting point about the spectrum. We see these like graphics on the internet where this is the spectrum in the UK, this is the spectrum in South America, and this is what the left is in America. And of course, we're way further to the right. I have always felt, and I don't know if this is just like my wild theory, that this is all based on like a series of polling questions, and which
exactly. And if they let you write the polling questions, Nomi, you'd have a completely different results. Or if they let you like dictate the programming on CNN or something like that, it's like if you have those kind of tools, or say for example, President Obama had been really innovative and really forceful and really bold and had put all kinds of things on the policy agenda that weren't there previously. Well, we'd be arguing about those things today. Exactly. Or say Occupy Wall Street was still around. There's a million things that could be different, and all of people's attitudes would be completely changed. Those kinds of statistics and charts that you're describing are just ways of turning your brain off. By the way, to get back to Biden, I totally agree with you that he's a huge disappointment on the issues. But I may be the only guy in America who did this. I read his entire interview with the New York Times editorial board. I read the whole thing. It took like 2 hours, but I read it word for word. And it's funny because he's and I don't want to compare him to Trump. That would be cruel. But verbally, he and Trump are really similar. Trump sort of free associates and gets things really wildly wrong. And Biden also will be wandering along, and then his brain will like slip a gear or something, and he'll be talking about something completely different with no indication, right? And it's just a mess. And you're reading this, and he's alternately really disappointing. He's denying all sorts of things that he obviously did. He's claiming credit for things that he had nothing to do with. Like if anything good happened in the Obama years, it's his doing. Right. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, on and on and on. And it's incoherent. But then you get to I think it's the last question, and they ask him about blue collar voters, specifically white working class voters. And Biden had a really good answer that he delivered in complete sentences. Clearly all of a sudden his brain turned on, and he was able to, and he said, look, we all think that these people are so reactionary, but if you frame things in the right way, they can be more progressive than you and me, a lot more. And he put it very well, I thought. And so the man has there is this level on which he still connects with those voters. And again, those are going to be the swing voters one more time in 2020. And, by the way, one of the good things about this particular go-round is that the Democratic Party seems to understand that now, whereas in the past they've always been in complete denial about that. But this time they know it, and they're thinking about what to do about it. And I thought that was kind of charming and and interesting, and it kind of made me like him a little bit. But I agree with you; he's a complete disappointment on the issues, and ultimately he's going to wander into a lot of the same traps that Hillary wandered into. This complete complacency. Speaking of charts, the other day I was looking at a graphic from 2016 that was charting the two candidates at the time on a number of issues. And although the text that accompanied this, really boring political science kind of graphics, the text didn't point this out. But I noticed that Trump was being the Republican, was to Hillary's right on every issue, except for one. Trump was either perceived by the political scientist or by the public, I couldn't tell which, as being to Hillary's left, like well to her left, on trade issues. And there was also the social insurance issues where it just wasn't clear. It looked like they were completely occupying the same spot. And this is a source of danger to the Democrats, and they don't understand that when you let a guy like Trump be perceived as, being to your left on one or two of these issues, you're in trouble. It caused and by the way, this is something the Democrats are still completely in denial about, is how Trump managed to beat them, what he did. They haven't really come to terms with that.
How many excuses have you heard at this point? I mean, in 2016, we heard a million, but...
Yes, right, and more since then, as Hillary has rolled them all out one after. I feel very sorry for her, though. I don't want to go after Hillary. She's clearly she's embittered by what happened to her, and who wouldn't be? I mean, it's dreadful, and I in some ways I feel very sorry for her. But it's as though for years they wanted to blame everything except for their own screw-ups, their own mistakes.
Well, especially after 4 years, you'd think that, I assume she's gone to therapy, as we all have, if we can get it.
You speak for yourself, Nomi. I was the one who's out there. It's like, I wrote a whole book about this before it happened. Come on.
You could have written pre what happened.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. But for a while they were willing to blame James Comey. Do you remember that?
Yes,
but then they changed their minds about that. He became a kind of hero for them, and so they won't even blame him anymore. So there's still a lot of denial. And the people who managed the Hillary fiasco, they all sort of got kicked upstairs, went on to Harvard or whatever it is, and they're still in the game, and they're doing great.
How does that work? I mean, you've been very good at explaining how this system works.
That is Washington. If you were in with the right people, there appears to be no downside ever. It's highly ironic, Nomi, that one of the great sort of points of almost religious faith for this faction of the Democratic Party is the idea of meritocracy. They love this idea. They consider themselves to be products of the meritocracy. Meritocracy is what made America great, and they always mean by meritocracy, they mean how you did in school, where you went to college, that kind of thing. They don't mean the sort of Ayn Rand meritocracy, where it's the most forceful, strongest, richest guy muscles his way to the top and stays there. They mean, I got good grades in high school. I did well in the SAT. Therefore, I deserve everything that I've got. And what's funny is that the same people who believe in this so profoundly, there is never any accountability for these people. You can't have a meritocracy without accountability. Right. And these people just go from failure to failure to failure. It's extraordinary.
They're literally failing their way up, and they punish people who.
The rest of us live in a brutal meritocracy. By the way, I have been, I'm writing a book about populism now. Did I tell you this?
Tell us about it.
Yeah, and I've been working on it for a year and a half, and I'm very close to the last stages. The book is going to come out in June. And
what timing?
Well, we shall see. But I've been working. I'm dealing with the copy edits right now, and I'm on it 24/7, as you might imagine, and. But one of the really weird things that I have come across is the way, as the Democrats, as the sort of centrist faction took over the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party moved away from organized labor and lost touch with the concerns of working people and became a very different party. That's the subject of Listen Liberal, by the way. But as that happened, Republicans learned how to, and I've written about this before as well, but Republicans learned how to mimic left-wing language, how to do this kind of, this is what I used to call fake populism. This is what What's the Matter with Kansas was all about. Right. But it's gotten so much worse since What's the Matter with Kansas came out. And I was watching you can watch this too. There's this debate between Steve Bannon and David Frum, a conservative versus a conservative. It happened in, I think, Toronto, Canada, and they filmed it, and you can watch it on YouTube or whatever it is. I forget where you have to go to watch it. But in the course of this debate, Steve Bannon, of all people, this is the great villain of of Trump's rise. But Steve Bannon says something to the effect of, in America, we have socialism for the rich and a brutal Darwinian struggle for everybody else.
That's right.
So it's meritocracy for you and me, but these people on top are just like, there's never any accountability for them. Mm-hmm. And that's always been, in my lifetime, has been something that my kind of bitter, cynical left-wing friends say to one another. They read Noam Chomsky and say stuff like this. Well, now it's Republicans saying this. Yeah. And it boggles the mind how they have swiped one after another these kind of left-wing talking points and bent them to their own purposes. Of course, the results are always the same. Paul Ryan gets tax cuts, right? Mm-hmm. More tax cuts, cuts, right? But the talking points are fascinating. They steal from us.
So what's so interesting about that, I understand that Donald Trump had this power over, especially the New York media, and he could get free airtime. But I wonder
on and on and on.
I wonder if they could have, if they had somebody that, wasn't a billionaire, but somehow was able to get free airtime and was an actual populist, would they have run with that person instead? Because
the R's or the D's?
The R's, the Republicans. Because, Donald Trump obviously didn't come from working class background. He came from Queens.
Of course not. But yeah, his remember they used to call him the blue collar billionaire.
Right.
And there's one of these fake populist books that I was looking through is called Billionaire at the Barricades. I mean, there's all of this imagery of there's all of this imagery of Donald Trump, driving a tractor. Donald Trump,
right? Yes. I remember those with his red hat. I can't wait to see him up against Bernie Sanders.
Well, that is wow! Isn't that going to be a mind-blowing, confrontation if that actually comes to pass? My suspicion is that Bernie would whip his ass, except for there's a couple complications, and one of them is that the Democratic Party has become, to a certain degree, the party of Wall Street and the party of Silicon Valley. I mean, you look at who funded Obama and who funded Hillary Clinton's run, and Silicon Valley's up there. A lot of universities. Well, those people don't like Bernie Sanders.
They don't like regulations, for sure.
Right? No, they might change sides.
Yes.
So I think Bernie would have, if all other things were equal, if the candidates were roughly matched in terms of fundraising and what they could spend on the campaign trail and that sort of thing, I think Bernie would have it would be a wipeout. He would wail on Donald Trump, but it could get tricky if you see something like that happening. Now, the historical answer to that is Franklin Roosevelt. So in 1936, this is another subject that I've been researching. In 1936, the powers that be in this country turned against Roosevelt in an overwhelming way. I don't, the fundraising, we don't know exactly what it was.
Because he took them on, right?
Right, he took them on, but the corporate world was against him in this sort of unprecedented way. I mean, shoulder to shoulder with unanimity. They had the press on their side. Roosevelt thought the press was against him by 85%. Every newspaper endorsed his opponent. You go right down the list. It was this extraordinary display of unanimity by the establishment. And Roosevelt beat him and beat the Republican in one of the, I think still to this day, the all-time biggest landslide in U.S. history. He won every state except for Maine and Vermont.
Unbelievable.
It was just an overwhelming defeat or victory. And obviously that's the model. If you can build a movement, if you have a movement behind you, you can do things like that. And it doesn't really matter how much money the other team has raised. Well, today, I don't know. I don't know if that sort of thing is possible. Anyhow, if Bernie gets the nomination, we're going to find out, Nomi. It's going to be absolutely fascinating because I don't think Wall Street votes would put its money where its values are. They have their very liberal values on all sorts of culture war matters, all sorts of other questions. But ultimately, for them, what matters is who's going to regulate them, who's going to make them pay taxes,
and that's really just the top, though. I mean, you see libertarians, Silicon Valley. I don't know if there's enough votes to swap out.
No, but the money. The money,
right? Exactly.
They are, as one of my friends puts it, that's the new Wall Street. I mean, in some ways, they're going to be bigger players than Wall Street was.
And they're powerful in other ways, too. I mean, we see who they're lining up with, who their investors are. You have foreign entities.
Powerful in other ways. Wait a minute. You're talking to someone, my industry is being swallowed by Facebook, journalism. It's the most extraordinary thing. It's happening before our eyes, and nobody's lifting a finger to stop them.
And no one's asking questions. I mean, yes, people are asking questions about who their investors are, but we talk about foreign meddling in elections all day long, but we don't say, why is it that Russian interests, Russian oligarchs are investing in Facebook or Saudi Arabian, and what kind of play is that in America? But some of the tech companies, of course, that are based in other countries that have looser regulations, there's been a lot of conversation about that. And how does the tool affect an election? So if you have, some app that's based in China, yes. Is that affecting the election?
I know. Well, you're getting into a territory that I don't know a lot about.
Much bigger conversation.
And whenever anybody brings this kind of thing up, I'll go immediately George Orwell on them. And I my whole life, I've always expected the worst. But expecting the worst today is kind of, it's too dark, even for me, Yeah. So.
On that note, they're watching us.
I know.
It's
like my refrigerator is watching me.
It literally is. I've seen these. I'm like, why does your refrigerator need to have these tools? I mean, just buy a cheap refrigerator.
No, I'm seriously. I'm like going to start buying old appliances.
Yeah. Like
this monitor top refrigerator. I mean, they not only do they not spy on you, but they look really good. They're streamlined.
They should. You should get there should be a business like people who are buying old records, buy
hey, I never threw mine away. I'm a total vinyl. I mean, I have 2 record players plugged in at this moment. Everything in this house is there's a total retro technology here.
Live the retro life, flip phones and old refrigerators.
That's an excellent idea.
Sounds great. It's the good old days. I do want to go back to the good old days, at least in some aspects.
Well, hey, an extremely liberal Democrat, like absolutely wailing on a conservative Republican by the biggest landslide of all time. I like that.
That sounds great.
I'd like to see that happen again.
We'd like a more diverse party, though. They didn't have that back then. But,
right.
we learn in some ways. Thomas Frank You're amazing. I feel like we could talk for hours, and I would love to have you back on to discuss the state of the race. Maybe your book will be done by then, hopefully.
Yes, so it'll be out in June. It's gonna be awesome. And I'll be posting. I haven't been on social media in I think a year and a half. And but I'll be letting the world know. And yeah, the book will be out in June, and it's going to be, well, I don't know. I hope it's going to be good. I don't want to jinx it.
It's good timing, and I think that might be the trick for writing a book, is not going on social media. It's my issue.
Yeah.
All right, Thomas, thank you very much.
You got it. We'll talk to you soon.